Broadcasting from the campus of Salisbury University, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR Newstalk 90.7. Putting Delmarva first. It's time for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
Is agriculture in Maryland being heard in Annapolis? Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. Agriculture is the largest industry in Maryland with more than 12,000 farms covering more than 2 million acres. It produces $1.3 billion in agricultural products every year and employs 350,000 workers. But recently, Jim Perdue, chair of Perdue Farm, said that he believes the industry, in his words, has no seat at the table in Maryland when it comes to environmental regulations. This morning, we want to explore just what kind of relationship there is between this major industry and Annapolis, and is it true that agriculture is not being heard? This morning, we have in our studio Eddie Johnson. He's president of the Somerset County Farm Bureau, and also Kathy Phillips, executive director of the State Coastal Trust, and I appreciate both of you stopping by. Eddie, I want to start with you. Do you think that agriculture has a seat at the table in Maryland and Annapolis?
No.
Why is that?
Well, years ago when we started the hysteria with Governor Schaefer, he called us the outhouse. So if we've got a seat at the table, I hope it's a two-seater in that outhouse, because that's as far as we're getting. Granted, they do listen a little better when it's election year, but in the off years, no, we have no seat at the table.
Well, what specific kinds of issues would you cite that indicate to you that you're not being heard?
The passage of the phosphorus management tool for major things. It cannot measure the amount of phosphorus leaving the soil. We've met our 2012-13 goals. We're on target to meet the 2017 and 25 goals. Why do we need a phosphorus management tool?
Kathy, what do you think? What do you think the relationship is between agriculture and Annapolis?
Well, I certainly can't speak for the Farm Bureau that as to whether agriculture has an adequate seat at the table or not. But I think that a lot of the information that has come out over the past couple of years, and especially during this discussion, I think shows that certainly the Farm Bureau has a very adequate seat at the table based on the amount of money that the American Farm Bureau pays their lobbyists each year, and the amount of money that goes into paying lobbyists in Annapolis to represent the agricultural community. Now, that being said, Mr. Johnson here brought up the fact that about the PMT, that he feels that they didn't have a seat at the table for discussions about the PMT. When the PMT regulations were first working their way through the legislature, the Farm Bureau was there. The agricultural community was there. They were one of the original stakeholders involved in this whole process, as was the environmental community, as were a number of other stakeholders. There was a complete process that took place, and these regulations were voted in by all of the state legislators. I think what happened and created this situation that now has a lot of farmers obviously upset and feeling nervous is the fact that I don't think enough information was communicated to the greater agricultural community about the phosphorus management tool. I think that the industry and the trade associations kind of let it go until it came to the point where, all right, now it's 2014, it's time to implement this plan. And everybody said, well, how are we going to implement it? There was no plan in place to implement it. The need is there for it. I will disagree with Mr. Johnson about about agriculture in the state of Maryland meeting its goals as compared to other industries in the state of Maryland meeting its goals. If you do look backward at 2011, 2013, as he said, yes, they were meeting their goals at that point. But looking forward, until something is done about phosphorus pollution to the waterways, the state is not going to meet its 2017 or even 2025 goals.
Let me turn to Eddie and give him a chance to respond. And particularly, I'm interested in the idea that the Farm Bureau and folks were at the table when these proposals were first being discussed, because that would indicate that somebody was at least at the table.
You can be at the table and not be heard, and that's essentially, I feel, that the position Farm Bureau was in. They were at the table, but they weren't heard. The letter to Secretary Earl Hance, November 14, 2013, phosphorus management tool cannot be used to determine how much phosphorus will or will not leave a particular field. On down from that, the Chesapeake Bay Foundation in October 2013 fact sheet entitled Manure Not the Leading Cause of Nitrogen Pollution in the Chesapeake Bay shares this concern. Why do we need a phosphorus management tool if it's not manure that's causing the problem? 97% of the water that comes in the bay comes from three rivers. Comes from the Susquehanna, the Potomac, and the James. 95% of it. They're all north of us. We're the only place in Maryland that has oysters, out here in the Tangier Sound. If we were the polluters, as we're alleged to be with the poultry litter, there would be no oysters in the Tangier Sound.
Now, the state legislature sort of put a halt on this, and a planned program, for that matter, got a halt on it. And one of the things that the legislature did was say, well, we want to see an economic impact study, even though I got indications from Hance that they had looked at some of that already. But nonetheless, the idea was to take a look at the economic impact. It would seem to me that agriculture had enough pushback that when these regulations came up, however, whether they're interpreted properly or not, that it could say, well, no, wait a minute, we're stopping this in its tracks. I mean, isn't that some kind of significant influence on what's going on in Annapolis?
I think Richard Colburn was the one who actually filed a bill to stop the...
Right.
And make them do the economic impact study. However, that's still been just been completed and has not been released yet. There were a few farmers on the committee. There were some environmentalists on the committee, and I don't know if they've even heard the report back yet. I don't think they have. The report was supposed to be announced earlier this week, and it's been postponed and postponed and postponed. And my understanding now, it won't be released till after the election.
Does it respond at all, Kathy, or before we just move on?
Well, I was going to address that issue because I did have, I was on the macro panel of this economic impact study, and we had a micro panel and a macro panel with about 20 people on each panel. The micro panel was all from the farming community. The macro panel was a combination of environmental organizations and farmers. I have to say that process, unfortunately, really went awry. Those of us that sat on these two panels, we feel like, well, me personally, I looked forward to the opportunity of taking part in this economic impact study and this process of having this micro and macro panel of actual farmers and on the ground folks from various environmental communities and civic organizations, all really around a table. This was the table, and these were the seats, and it was really the first time that this diverse community was going to come together and actually talk about this issue and put together information and give as much information as possible to Beacon so that they could try to put this study together. That never happened. That process was, and pardon the pun, but polluted from the very start because the politicians sat in the rooms during these micro and macro panels, and they when we had our in-person meetings, when we were trying to have telephone conference calls, industry representatives were always there in the room too. Neither panel, and you can talk to some of the farmers that were on these panels, and I think you'll find that they'll agree with me. We never had the opportunity to do the job that was put in front of us by these panels, by this process. And we really felt by the time we we were supposed to have seen a bibliography of all the data that was turned in by the micro and macro panels. No one on either panel ever had an opportunity to see that bibliography, and we were supposed to have been part of the vetting process of the study at the same time that it was going through the peer review process before it became public. We never had that opportunity either. And yes, everyone is completely in the dark now about what has happened with this study. And I feel that the entire process has I don't think this study is really going to have it's just unfortunate that this whole process became political instead of being what it really should have been, was an opportunity to come together, figure out what to do to get the PMT into place, what to do with all of this excess manure, and really get a good dialogue going in both the environmental, the agricultural community, the business community, of how are we going to deal with all this manure on the Eastern Shore to relieve this issue that we have with phosphorus pollution.
Let me move away from that for just a moment, and we'll see what kind of report comes out. As Eddie indicated, it's been delayed. It's been delayed again. Matter of fact, I think somebody at one point said it was supposed to come out later this week. Now it's been postponed again. We'll see about that. But let me just sort of, I'll raise, because I wanted to raise this. The Baltimore Sun obviously pushed back on Mr. Perdue's remarks and said basically, look, that agriculture does have a seat at the table. And what they cited, and Eddie, I want you to respond to this. They said, look, Governor O'Malley threatened to veto the 5-cent chicken tax that was proposed. In the Hudson case, the Hudson Farm case, the governor emailed the Perdue lawyer saying, never too busy to hear from you. I heard a number of, and I remember when this issue came up, the governor and other state officials said, no, we don't think the lawsuit's a good idea. And obviously then we had the delay in the phosphorus management tool. In other words, the Sun basically is that this is the influence that agriculture has on Annapolis. What do you make of that argument? Do you think there's some legitimacy there, or is it that you have some influence but not as much as you think you should have? What do you think's going on there?
They listen unless it's election year, but now the governor that made all the comments about this, it has higher aspirations than just being governor of Maryland. Supposedly, he's promised the environmentalists that this PMT will be passed before he leaves office. If so, why do we even bother to have the economic impact study if it's going to get passed anyway? And the economic impact study is going to show that we got hundreds and thousands of tons of manure that's got to be put somewhere. The state says they have home for it, but there's no home for that much manure. And the study only involved the three lower counties, or was it 4?
It was 4. It included.
Okay, 4 lower counties. What about the dairy farmers in Frederick? What about the municipalities that have sludge to deal with now that cannot spread sludge between November 15th and March 1st? How are they going to store all that sludge? Will it all be gone to the landfill? What's going to happen? Since the lawsuit, Ocean City puts theirs in the landfill now. Nobody wants to handle it. And it's going to come to the same thing with manure if we keep passing regulations.
Right, although at this point the regulations are stalled. Doesn't that indicate the pushback, particularly in Annapolis, doesn't that indicate that that agriculture has some kind of seat at the table if it can delay it, as opposed to the regulations just sort of going in and happening?
That's our hope, that they're listening now, and that the regulations will be stopped, because it will kill the poultry industry on the Eastern Shore.
Well, let me turn to something else, because as I was looking, I've only been on the shore for about 10 years. I've worked in Washington for a long time, and one of the things that struck me about Maryland is that there is a trajectory in which Paris Glendening, the governor, there seemed to be an approach to the environment and to farming, agriculture, as sort of this approach of imposing rules and regulations on the agriculture industry, and that after Glendening, you get shifting that going on. Obviously, you had Bob Ehrlich who came in, but there's been a shift to this idea, particularly a lot of environmentalists saying, no, maybe that's not the way to do this. Maybe we need to work with them. And there has been sort of this, cover crop issue, for example, and encouraging preservation. Do you think, particularly those years, Kathy, coming out of Glendening, that somehow the stew got spoiled, and that even a shift that some environmentalists have admitted themselves to me as I talk to them, of trying to pull in more voluntarily the farmers in order to get something done. Is that a proper way to look at this trajectory? Because they look at Glenn Enning, and he talks about the quotes, and aside from the quotes, there does seem to be some regulatory backup to that approach. We're going to force you to do something, as opposed to let's see whether we can pay for the cost and figure out how to do it. How do you?
Well, first of all, I'd love to get away from this. The language that you've been using for most of the show, relating to farmers, environmentalists. We really need to move away from that, because what we're talking about here it's not environmentalists. It's people who live in this state, farmers, teachers, housewives like me. We all are concerned about both the Chesapeake Bay and certainly for me, my coastal bays, and keeping our waterways healthy. We don't want to have a situation like this country had on Lake Erie and Toledo, losing its water supply source. We don't want to have something happen like on the St. Johns River in Florida, where boats can't even go up and down certain tributaries to the St. Johns because algae is so thick it clogs up the motors. This is all from nutrient pollution, and this nutrient pollution is coming from many sources. It's coming from agriculture, it's coming from wastewater, it's coming from the fertilizer that we put on our yards. Everybody has to do their fair share to prevent this pollution from further degrading our waterways. Wastewater already is permitted. They pay fees. They are monitored. They have to submit reports daily and monthly. They have to keep daily reports. They have to submit reports monthly, annually. It's the only way to know if wastewater is controlling its nutrient loads to our waterways. The guy who has a paint shop, an auto paint shop, he has a permit too. It's he has to control air emissions. He has to control water discharges from his business. We all are regulated in one way or another if we're involved in something that has a waste product that can get out and provide and cause a health hazard to our air, to our water. So it's not that the agricultural community is being put upon. It's how we keep our rivers from burning in this country, and it's how we keep our waterways healthy enough that you can even put a boat on the waterway and go fishing and not worry about dying from eating the fish that you catch. So I think we have to get away from that argument and everybody just agree that everyone has to do their fair share. And agriculture is a big industry in this state, as Mr. Johnson has stated earlier on, and as you stated in your opening remarks. So it's going to have a little bit bigger responsibility. But if it doesn't meet its responsibilities, then these other sectors, wastewater, and you talked about sewage sludge, these other sectors are going to have to pick up the weight and the responsibility for helping us meet our TMDL goals.
Anyone, I want you to respond. What's your observations?
Enough regulations are enough regulations. Maryland farmers are at an economic disadvantage compared to the farmers in the surrounding states. Delaware doesn't have any rules like this. Virginia has no rules like this. Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, they're all part of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Farmers are your first environmentalists. They save the bay every day. They work hard out here at saving the bay. They really do. The economic disadvantage will cause some farmers to go out. If this phosphorus management tool comes through, farmers will be leaving the land. When they do, it'll become homes. For every home, the cost of service study in Wycomico County predicted that for every dollar you take in, it costs you $1.21 for goods and services that community or household will draw on your schools and other public facilities. If it goes to commercial, a dollar in is 33 cents cost. Farming is a dollar in and 97 cents cost. So farming is a better use of land than is homes. There's much less pollution from agriculture than it is from homes. If we switch from chicken manure to commercial fertilizer, you're then doing away with organic, slow-release fertilizer and going to a fast-acting chemical fertilizer. If all this manure must be replaced by chemical fertilizer, the bay will become in worse shape than it is now.
Let me. Well, go ahead, Kathy. Respond. And one of the things that struck me is, particularly about this discussion as I've watched it over the last 10 years, is that the Chesapeake Bay 100 years ago or 200 years ago, nobody worried about it because we weren't monitoring the bay, and B, we didn't have the kind of chickens and farming that we have today. Now we say, well, farmers in this area can't necessarily compete with, say, farmers, say in Arkansas, where they don't have such regulations, which means that we may have a social cost of cleaning up the bay. The question is, who pays for it? And one of the ways to pay for it would be, okay, if you want farmers to do X, say phosphorus, then you have to provide the funds so that they can compete with somebody else. So I want you to respond to what Eddie said, but also this idea of social costs and who's going to pay for it. I mean, how do we do this?
Well, all right. To answer that question, and it's a good question. You know, does the state, and when you say the state, you mean us, the taxpayers, have to bear the full burden of this? Well, you know, this pollution problem is coming from animal manures, and certainly here on the Eastern Shore, it is poultry manure. You have billion-dollar corporations that are creating this waste stream. It's being kind of left on the farming community to figure out what to do with this waste stream. But this is, the phosphorus management tool is just one thing that is going to help move this state towards bringing in the poultry corporations and having them pay their fair share and be part of helping to fund the cost for this. But what I'd also like to address, another issue that Mr. Johnson brought up is, rather than just saying flat out, this phosphorus management tool is going to kill farming on the Eastern Shore and, you know, it's sort of Chicken Little, sky is falling scenario. Instead, new regulations like these drive new technologies, and they help to create new industries and new ways of dealing with this pollution. You know, before the Clean Water Act, before regulations came in to control wastewater, sewage was just being straight dumped in. The municipalities didn't know how to treat their sewage. When the Clean Water Act came about and said you can't dump your sewage in the waterways anymore, lo and behold, entrepreneurial minds got together and they created new technologies in the wastewater industry that clean the water. So that, for instance, right now, Berlin, Maryland, with its new wastewater treatment plant that is fully upgraded, the effluent that comes out at the end of the day from that wastewater treatment plant is so low in nutrients and other pollutants. It's a far cry from what it used to be years ago. And even still, the town of Berlin sprays that effluent on land rather than discharge it straight into our waterways. I'm saying that let this tool come into play and let it do what it's supposed to do. And then let's drive new technologies to better handle this excess manure. Let's get subsurface applicators for manure application to land rather than just having one or two examples of them here on the Eastern Shore that kind of get brought out once a year, you know, to show that, hey, we have this technology, but everybody doesn't have one. They're incredibly expensive. So let's find ways to get more money to help put more of these out, and process of putting manure into a spreader and running it across fields on a day when there's 25, 30 mile an hour winds blowing and all of that manure is going everywhere except right where it's supposed to go. Let's get this new modern technology in full use, not just as an example of technology that could be used. Let's have it being used.
I want to give Eddie just a few seconds left. What you feeling at all that you're going to be heard in Annapolis with this?
We've spent $4 million in the last 10 years on best management practices here in the lower shore. That needs to be noted somewhere in Annapolis. That we spent
a good deal of that money.
Farm families voluntarily have spent $4 million on 3 chicken farm best management practices: the heavy use pads, manure store buildings, and carcass composters. Through genetics and feed management, we're doing a better job. We've added phytase to the feed. Genetics have changed. We're making a better bird that can utilize the nutrients that we're putting in the feed.
Okay, got to cut you there. I'm sure we could go on for another half hour. We've been talking with Eddie Johnson. He's president of the Somerset County Farm Bureau. Also, Kathy Phillips, the executive director of the Assiniboia Coastal Trust. I appreciate both of you coming and discussing the issue with us this morning.
Thank you very much, Don, for the opportunity.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush, and thanks for listening.
This has been Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Chris Rank produces and is our audio engineer. Don Rush is your host. For podcasts, visit our website, delmarvapublicradio.net, or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast in iTunes. Delmarva Today can now be seen on PAC 14. To view the schedule, visit the Daily Times or visit pac14.org.